We had always been close, inseparable since birth. My twin brother and I shared everything: childhood secrets, school projects, even our friends. Our bond was something I never questioned, something that felt constant, like a steady beat in the background of my life. He was my best friend, my confidant, the one person who understood me better than anyone else ever could. I always thought our connection was unique, but there was something different about it lately. It started subtly, a shift I couldn't quite place. I began noticing the way he looked at me, the lingering touches that were more than what was necessary for a sibling. At first, I brushed it off as nothing, just a momentary lapse in his usually carefree demeanor. But the more I thought about it, the more unsettling it became. I found myself feeling things I shouldn't, things I had never felt before toward him. An unfamiliar tightness in my chest whenever our hands brushed, a strange flutter in my stomach when he smiled at me in a way that seemed more intense than usual. I had always been comfortable around him. He was my twin, after all. But now, I felt self-conscious in his presence, as if I was suddenly aware of every word, every glance, every breath we shared. It was as though we were dancing around something neither of us had the courage to acknowledge. In the quiet of our shared moments, I began to feel the pull of something unspoken between us. It was in the way he touched my shoulder when we were laughing, in the way his eyes followed me just a little longer than they should. He never said anything directly, but I could tell something was shifting in him, just as it was shifting in me. We would spend hours together, doing nothing but talking about the things we used to talk about: school, our friends, life. But it felt different now. His words seemed to carry weight. His jokes felt more pointed, as though they were aimed at something deeper, something that I couldn't quite grasp. I started to feel like I was walking a tightrope, one that hovered between familiarity and something else entirely. But I didn't know how to talk about it. I didn't know how to name it. I tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination running wild. But there were moments, fleeting but undeniable, when I caught him looking at me, and his gaze wasn't just that of a brother. It was different, more intense, more intimate. I found myself avoiding his eyes, hoping that if I didn't acknowledge the way I felt, the tension between us would fade. But it didn't. There was a part of me that was terrified, a part that feared acknowledging what was happening. I didn't want to ruin everything we had, didn't want to risk the one stable relationship in my life for something I wasn't even sure was real. I kept telling myself that it was just a phase, just a passing moment of confusion, but deep down I knew better. It wasn't just a phase. It was something that had been building for a while, something neither of us had the courage to face. As time passed, I became more restless, more uncertain. I began questioning everything: our closeness, our bond, the way we interacted. I couldn't help but wonder if he felt the same way I did, or if I was just reading too much into things. But then, there were moments, brief, fleeting moments, that made me think that maybe, just maybe, he was feeling the same confusion, the same pull. I tried to ignore it. I tried to convince myself that we were just siblings, that nothing had changed. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something between us was different now. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. And every time I looked at him, every time our hands brushed or our eyes met, I couldn't help but wonder if he felt it too. It was an ordinary afternoon, or at least it started that way. My brother and I were alone at home, the quietness of the house a sharp contrast to the usual noise that filled our lives. We had been spending a lot of time together lately, but something felt different today, as if the silence was heavier, more loaded than usual. We had no plans, no expectations. We were just hanging out like we always did. But today, everything felt more intense. We were sitting on the couch, watching a show we had seen 100 times before, yet neither of us was really paying attention to it. My mind kept drifting to thoughts I didn't want to have, thoughts that were impossible to ignore now. Every time I glanced at him, there was this subtle shift in the air. It was as though the space between us had grown smaller. The distance that had once felt comfortable now felt suffocating. I tried to shake it off, to focus on the screen in front of me, but my attention kept snapping back to him. He was sitting close, closer than usual, and I could feel his presence like it was pressing against me. There was no reason for it, no clear explanation, but I could sense that something was about to happen. Then it happened. He reached out to adjust something on the couch, and his hand brushed against mine. The contact was light, almost accidental, but it sent a jolt through me. A spark, an electric shock that seemed to pulse through my entire body. I froze for a moment, unsure of how to react. His hand didn't move away, though. It lingered there, just for a second longer than it should have. I could feel the warmth of his skin against mine, and my heart started to beat faster. I looked at him, and for a split second his eyes met mine. There was something in that look. Something deeper, something more than just the usual brotherly affection. I tried to pull my hand away, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed by the moment. It felt like everything had slowed down. My pulse was racing, my breath shallow. It wasn't just an innocent touch anymore. There was something in the way he held my hand, in the way his fingers lightly traced the back of mine, that told me this wasn't normal. This wasn't how siblings were supposed to behave. His face was inches from mine, and I could see the uncertainty in his eyes. It was as if he was waiting for me to say something, to do something. But I couldn't. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I didn't know what was happening, but I couldn't deny it. This moment, this charged silence, was everything we hadn't talked about, everything we had been avoiding for so long. I could feel the tension building between us, thick and undeniable. He pulled his hand away slowly, almost reluctantly, but the damage had been done. The connection between us had shifted irreparably. The silence that followed was deafening. Neither of us said a word, but everything felt different now. I could feel the weight of his presence next to me, the heat of the space he had just vacated, as if he had left a part of himself there. I wanted to speak, to break the silence, but I didn't know what to say. What could I say? What was there to say? We both knew what had just happened. We both knew that this wasn't just a mistake. It wasn't just an accident. There was something there, something real and impossible to ignore. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my mind racing. This wasn't what I had expected, not in a million years. But now that it had happened, I couldn't pretend it didn't matter. I couldn't pretend that I wasn't shaken by it. The feelings I had been trying to bury, the ones that had been lurking in the back of my mind for so long, suddenly felt like they had surfaced, and I couldn't push them back down. He shifted in his seat, avoiding my gaze, but I could tell he was feeling the essay. The next few days were unbearable. Every time I looked at my brother, I felt the weight of what had happened, lingering between us like an unspoken truth neither of us was willing to confront. It was suffocating. The space between us had shifted, and I couldn't figure out how to fill it or make sense of it. What had started as a single moment, a fleeting touch, had now become an inescapable reality that threatened to unravel everything. We barely spoke. The tension was too thick, too raw. Whenever we were in the same room, I could feel the discomfort between us, the way he tried to avoid my gaze, the way his voice cracked when he spoke. I wanted to reach out, to say something, but the words were caught in my throat. I didn't know how to ask him what had happened, what it meant. I didn't know how to explain what I was feeling. Everything was tangled up in confusion and guilt. I tried to act like nothing had changed, like things were normal, but it was impossible. Every time we passed each other in the hallway or exchanged a simple greeting, I was acutely aware of the unspoken distance that now existed. I felt sick with guilt. I hated that I was thinking about it, hating that I couldn't just push it all away like it was nothing. But it wasn't nothing. It wasn't something I could simply forget or move on from. He hadn't said a word about it. Not a single word. I kept expecting him to apologize or explain, but he didn't. He seemed just as lost as I was, maybe even more so. His avoidance made it worse, though. It was as if he couldn't even look at me without feeling ashamed. I couldn't blame him. I felt ashamed too. But there was something else there too, something unspoken, a tension that ran deeper than guilt. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was avoiding me because he was scared of what had happened, scared of what it meant. But was he afraid of the same things I was? Was he just as torn up inside, just as confused? Or had he already pushed the incident to the back of his mind, dismissing it as a one-time mistake? The uncertainty gnawed at me. I had no answers, only questions. And the silence was making everything worse. I found myself replaying that moment over and over in my mind. The way his hand lingered against mine, the way his eyes briefly met mine in that charged silence. It wasn't a mistake. I knew that now. It wasn't something that could be brushed off as a moment of weakness. There was something there, something we couldn't deny. But what did it mean? And what did it mean for us? Could we go back to the way things were before? Was it possible to just pretend like it never happened? I thought about confronting him, about asking him what he thought about it all, but I was terrified. Terrified of what he might say, terrified of what it might do to our relationship. What if he didn't feel the same way? What if he was as repulsed by the idea as I was scared of it? What if this destroyed everything? The thought of losing him, of losing our bond, was unbearable. But the thought of pretending like nothing had happened was just as unbearable. I felt trapped. No matter what I did, no matter what I said, it felt like I was drowning in my own thoughts, my own feelings. The guilt was suffocating, and the desire to understand what had happened, what had changed, was consuming me. I had never felt so lost, so uncertain. My brother had always been the one person I could rely on, the one person who understood me. But now I didn't even know how to talk to him. Every day felt like a battle to ignore the growing gap between us, to pretend like everything was okay, when nothing felt okay at all. I couldn't keep pretending. I couldn't keep avoiding it. I needed answers. I needed to understand what was happening, what we were both feeling. But every time I looked at him, every time I thought about what had happened, I was paralyzed by fear. Fear of the truth, fear of what it might mean for us, fear of losing him forever. And so I did nothing. I stayed silent, as did he. The silence between us stretched out, suffocating, until it felt like it was the only thing left. And with every passing day, I could feel it getting harder to breathe. The silence between us had become unbearable. Every moment spent together felt like a pressure building, waiting to explode. I couldn't stand it any longer. The unresolved tension between my brother and me, the constant pushing and pulling, had reached its breaking point. I had to know. I had to understand what this meant, what we were both feeling. One evening, after days of avoiding each other, I decided to confront him. My heart was pounding in my chest, my hands clammy with nerves. I didn't know what I expected from the conversation, but I knew I couldn't keep living in this limbo, pretending that everything was fine when it so clearly wasn't. I found him in his room, sitting on the edge of his bed, his head lowered, like he had been lost in thought for hours. I stood there, unsure of how to start, but I knew I couldn't delay it any longer. "Hey," I said, my voice quiet, almost tentative. He didn't look up at first, and for a moment I thought he might ignore me, pretend nothing was wrong. But then he lifted his head, his eyes meeting mine, and the weight of everything we hadn't said hung in the air between us. "I can't keep doing this," I said, my voice shaking. "I can't keep pretending like nothing happened." His gaze shifted to the floor, and I saw the way his shoulders tensed, the way he closed himself off from me. He was just as afraid as I was, maybe more. His silence was deafening, and for a moment, I thought he wouldn't say anything at all. But then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he spoke. "I don't know what happened," he said, his words full of confusion. "I don't know what any of this means. But I can't just ignore it either. I can't pretend I didn't feel it." I swallowed hard, feeling a wave of emotion crash over me. This was the moment I had been waiting for. The truth, even if it was messy and complicated. I wanted to say something, to explain how I felt, but the words were stuck in my throat. So I just nodded, and we stood there in silence for a long time, two people trapped in the same moment, too scared to move forward. Finally, I spoke. "What do we do now? How do we fix this?" He looked at me, his face etched with uncertainty. "I don't know. I don't know if we can fix it. I don't know if it can be undone." The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. This wasn't something we could simply move past. It wasn't something we could just forget. It had changed everything. Our relationship, the way we saw each other, the way we felt about each other, Nothing would ever be the same again. There was no going back. But even though I knew this, I didn't want to let go. I didn't want to lose him, not like this. I didn't want to let one mistake, one moment of weakness, destroy the bond we had shared for so long. And yet, I knew that even if we somehow managed to move past it, we would never be the same again. The trust, the closeness we once had, was gone. Maybe it would come back over time. Maybe it wouldn't. But we couldn't undo what had happened. Maybe we just need time, I said quietly. Maybe we need to figure out what we want, what this all means. Maybe we don't have to make any decisions right now. He nodded, but the look in his eyes told me he was just as uncertain as I was. Yeah, he said softly. Maybe we do. We stood there, two people who once knew.